We are taught to treat a Puerto Rican Spanish surname as proof of Spanish blood. It isn't. It's a record of an exit. We assume two families with the same last name share a common grandfather. On the island, they often share nothing but the ink. We expect a commercial DNA result to match the family tree perfectly, but they are frequently charting entirely different centuries of the Puerto Rican past, and only one of them is leaving a forensic trail. Every Puerto Rican surname was deposited into the colonial record through one of four completely different demographic mechanisms: Canarian settler migration from the Canary Islands, Sephardic converso families fleeing the Spanish Inquisition, Spanish colonial military and administrative families from Castile and Extremadura, and the Emancipation Registry of 1873, which assigned surnames to approximately 31,000 formerly enslaved African-descended Puerto Ricans in a single administrative process. The same surname can trace to any one of these four origins, or to two of them simultaneously in different branches of the same family. The Y-chromosome haplogroup is a definitive instrument for tracking these direct paternal lines. I had to completely unlearn my assumptions about the Canarian settler wave. On paper, a Canary Islander is a Spanish citizen carrying a Spanish name into a Spanish colony. But if you look past the colonial bureaucracy and straight into the DNA, the mainland connection completely dissolves. Approximately 60% of Puerto Rico's European colonial settler population came not from the Castilian mainland, but from the Canary Islands, a Spanish archipelago positioned off the northwest coast of Africa. The Canary Islands sit closer to Morocco than to Madrid. They were the last major port of call for Spanish Atlantic voyages. Ships stopped there to resupply before crossing. And from the 17th century onward, they became the primary settler source for Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Venezuela specifically. The 17th and 18th century Canarian migration waves to Puerto Rico are documented in colonial demographic records. The most significant arrived in 1720, when several hundred Canarian families were sent specifically to Puerto Rico to establish interior settlements. Their surnames, Cintron, Pagan, Algarin, and others that genealogists describe as distinctly Puerto Rican rather than broadly Latin American, trace their colonial arrival through the Canary Islands, not through Seville or Cordoba. The genetic distinction matters because the Canary Islands had a pre-colonial indigenous population, the Guanche, who carried a measurably different haplogroup profile from mainland Iberian populations. Population genetics research has documented that Canarian populations carry elevated frequencies of North African Berber-associated haplogroups, including E1b1b on the paternal line and haplogroup U6 on the maternal line, which are rare in Castile and Andalusia, but present in the Canary Islands as a legacy of the Guanche founding population and its proximity to North Africa. If your Puerto Rican DNA test returns an unexpected North African ancestry percentage embedded inside your European ancestry category, and your family carries a surname from the Canarian settler wave, the test is not detecting a mystery other ancestry line. It is detecting your Guanche heritage, present in the Canarian settler who carried it to Puerto Rico 3 centuries ago and misclassified by a commercial reference panel that does not adequately distinguish Canarian European ancestry from Castilian European ancestry. The year 1492 wasn't just the year Columbus sailed, it was the year of the Alhambra decree, the total expulsion of Jewish families from Spain. To escape the subsequent trauma and the watchful eye of the Inquisition, many converso families fled to geographically remote colonial frontiers like Puerto Rico. Population genetics researchers studying Y-chromosome haplogroups in Puerto Rico have documented elevated frequencies of Levantine-associated haplogroups in some Puerto Rican male line communities relative to comparable mainland Spanish populations. These haplogroups, J1 and J2 in the paternal line, trace to the ancient Levant and arrived in Iberia through the Jewish diaspora before the expulsion. Their elevated presence in specific Puerto Rican communities relative to Castilian baseline populations is consistent with the documented historical pattern of converso families from Castile and Extremadura settling in Puerto Rico from the earliest colonial period onward. Several surnames that appear prominently in Puerto Rican genealogical records also appear in Castilian Inquisition proceedings from the 1490s through the 1540s in ways that genetic genealogists now cross-reference against haplogroup data to identify Sephardic founding lineages. This history operates entirely beneath the surface. When a converso family landed on the island, they adopted the language, practiced the faith, and faded completely into the colonial background. The Crown Census couldn't track them, and the Inquisition couldn't reach them, but the genome kept the record. If your results return a sudden Levantine signature alongside your European markers, you are not looking at a data anomaly. You are looking at a 500-year-old escape route preserved in your cells. If your result returns unexpected Middle Eastern or Sephardic Jewish ancestry alongside a European classification, and your family carries a Spanish surname from Puerto Rico's earliest colonial period, that result may be recording a 500-year-old Inquisition exit carried in your paternal haplogroup. What drew me to the 1873 registry is how explicitly it exposes the limits of a DNA test. A commercial reference panel returns a flat, clinical percentage, but this document archives the actual morning 31,000 people were handed their modern surnames, trapping an ancient West African lineage inside a Spanish colonial filing cabinet. The Moret Law of 1870 began the formal process. Full abolition was declared in Puerto Rico on March 22, 1873. Approximately 31,000 formerly enslaved persons received surnames in the registry process, some receiving the surnames of their former enslavers, some receiving surnames assigned by parish priests, some carrying names that had been passed within African-descended communities across generations without appearing in any official record. The registry is the document, but the DNA predates the registry by centuries. The African presence in Puerto Rico did not begin with the plantation economy. The earliest enslaved Africans arrived in Puerto Rico in the 1500s, decades before the large sugar plantation system was established, through Portuguese and early Spanish Atlantic trade connections that drew specifically from Senegambian West African communities. Wolof, Mandinga, and Fulani ethnic groups, through the Portuguese and early Spanish Atlantic trade connections that preceded the larger transatlantic slave trade of the 17th and 18th centuries. The specific haplogroup distribution this produced in Puerto Rican ancestry, concentrated around West African paternal lineages associated with Senegambian ethnic groups, is measurably distinct from Dominican or Cuban African ancestry, which drew more heavily from Gulf of Guinea and Central African populations. Surnames minted on March 22, 1873, operate under a completely different genetic architecture. A lineage carrying a Senegambian haplogroup isn't tracing a bloodline to Madrid. It is tracing the exact administrative coordinate where an African population reclaimed their autonomy and inherited a ledger. Look past that ledger, and the physical map of Puerto Rico takes over. You don't even need a laboratory to see where those names were headed. The mountain data connects everything that came before it. The colonial economic record makes the mountain interior gradient legible on its own, without any genomic study required to understand why it exists. The sugar economy that defined Puerto Rico's plantation system from the 18th century onward required specific geography, coastal flatlands, river valley irrigation, and direct port access for export. The Cordillera Central, the mountain range that runs through Puerto Rico's interior, was structurally incompatible with sugar production at plantation scale. The economy that developed there instead was coffee and tobacco, industries that Spanish colonial authorities promoted specifically to populate the interior, primarily through the Canarian settler waves that arrived from the 17th century onward. The demographic consequence of that economic division is documented in the municipal records of the 18th and 19th centuries. Interior municipalities, Utuado, Jayuya, Adjuntas, Orocovis, show surname concentrations from the Canarian settler waves and from the earliest pre-plantation colonial families who moved inland for cattle ranching. Coastal municipalities, Ponce, Mayagüez, the northern littoral, show the more heavily mixed demographic profile produced by the plantation economy's continuous demand for labor at scale, which brought enslaved African populations, later Spanish immigrant workers, and a more dynamic colonial demographic turnover. The haplogroup gradient that modern population genetics has documented across Puerto Rico, higher indigenous maternal frequencies in the interior, lower on the coast, is the genomic record of that economic geography. The Taíno communities who retreated to the Cordillera Central in the 16th century were never fully extracted because the mountain interior had no plantation economy requiring their extraction. The surname concentrations that appear in interior municipal baptism records from the 17th and 18th centuries and the indigenous haplogroup frequencies that population geneticists have documented in those same communities are pointing at the same historical process from two different directions. The deep interior of the Cordillera Central operated as a biological vault, finding an elevated indigenous maternal signature attached to a classic mountain municipality. Name means your ancestry has bypassed the plantation economy entirely, uncovering an isolated pocket where history and biology refuse to dilute. It forces you to look past the surface of a digital pie chart. The commercial DNA test returns a percentage, The percentage is real, but it operates as a flat summary of a massive human complexity. What it cannot tell you is which surname in your family tree is recording which ancestral thread, whether the European ancestry is Canarian with a Guanche North African signal, Castilian elite without one, or converso with a Levantine haplogroup, whether the African ancestry traces to the Senegambian early trade routes or the later Gulf of Guinea plantation economy, whether the indigenous ancestry is concentrated in a mountain interior founding line or distributed evenly through island-wide admixture. The Y-chromosome haplogroup and the mitochondrial haplogroup are the disambiguation tools the percentage alone cannot provide. The surname is the historical address where the colonial record stored the specific ancestor. The haplogroup is what that ancestor was carrying when they arrived at that address. The gap between your family story and your genetic makeup is where the true history of the island lives. If there's a relative in your circle trying to make sense of a number that doesn't fit the legend, pass them this tape. It's time they read the document. Thanks for watching.